The screen fades to black. A single sentence appears like a forgotten diary entry. She was carrying her father's child, and the whole town knew. The words linger, pulling you into a story that feels less like history and more like a nightmare passed down in whispers. Somewhere in the back roads of America, behind crooked fences and peeling barns, was a family that hid something the world was never meant to see. This isn't just rumor. This is the kind of secret that stains an entire bloodline. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. It began in a town most people would never bother to notice. The kind of place you pass through on a long drive, with fields of rusting farm equipment and houses leaning under the weight of their own years. But buried in its soil, hidden behind the polite smiles of neighbors and the false comfort of Sunday sermons, was a secret so grotesque it clung to the family like a curse. The daughter was no older than 14 when the whispers began, whispers about her stomach growing in ways no one dared to question aloud. In small towns, silence often feels safer than truth, and in this one, silence was a weapon, protecting a man who should have been shunned, but who instead sat at the head of the family table every night. People remembered her as quiet, withdrawn, the kind of girl who avoided the eyes of strangers. But if you looked closely, if you truly studied the way she carried herself, you'd notice something chilling. Her fear wasn't the fear of a child misbehaving. It was the fear of someone trapped, someone who knew that no escape was ever going to come. Every corner of her home reminded her of what was happening, and yet the walls themselves seemed to echo the command, "Say nothing." The father carried himself like many men of his time, stern, unyielding, a figure who demanded respect without earning it. To the outside world, he was simply a farmer, a husband, a provider. But behind closed doors, he was a predator. And the most disturbing part wasn't just what he had done, it was how the rest of the family looked away, how they convinced themselves that nothing was wrong. This is how cycles of inbreeding survive, not only through the cruelty of one man, but through the silence of many. When the truth could no longer be hidden, the community did what communities often do. They rewrote the story. They whispered about boys from outside the family, about shameful mistakes, about anything except the horror staring them in the face. Because admitting the truth meant confronting a nightmare, that the child growing inside the girl was not from a stranger, not from some faceless shadow, but from the man who raised her, her own father. The truth is never whispered in a single night. It creeps, slow and deliberate, through the walls of families that refuse to admit what they've done. In this case, the beginning of the nightmare did not start with the child. It began years earlier, in a house that everyone in the town pretended not to notice. The daughter was raised in a silence so thick, it was almost its own language. Neighbors would say the family never spoke much, that their curtains were always drawn, that their laughter, if it existed at all, was muffled, unnatural, hollow. When she was barely 13, whispers began. People claimed they had seen her walking alone at night, eyes wide and empty, as though she had been trained not to make noise, not to draw attention, not to exist. But there was always the shadow of another presence near her, an older man, a figure no one dared confront directly, though everyone knew who he was. That figure was her father. In small rural towns, you learn quickly which truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. Confronting a man inside his own walls meant you were inviting ruin, and so the community said nothing. It was inside those suffocating walls that the line between father and daughter was erased, replaced by something unspeakable. In the darkness of that house, a secret pact was formed, though not of her choosing. She became both child and prisoner, both daughter and vessel. As she grew older, her silence hardened into obedience, until she no longer looked like a teenager, but like a ghost wearing her own face. By the time she became pregnant, the town could no longer ignore it. But even then, their words were not of protection, not of outrage. They were of fear. People muttered that blood had twisted in on itself, that the family was cursed, that the child she carried would be born already marked. Yet no one came forward to help her, no one lifted a hand to break the cycle. It was easier to watch from afar, to convince themselves that the horror belonged to someone else, not to them. And that is how nightmares spread, by silence. Silence is not neutral. It feeds the very thing it avoids. And in this house, silence was the hand that guided her into the role no daughter should ever endure. The pregnancy changed everything, though not in the way most might imagine. For many families, a child signals hope, a new beginning. But in this household, the growing life inside her was nothing but a living reminder of a line that had folded in on itself. She carried not only her father's child, but also the crushing weight of generations that had chosen silence over truth. Her body became the evidence no one wanted to acknowledge. She walked through the town slower now, her belly swelling with the undeniable. The looks she received were sharp but fleeting. Neighbors turned their faces before she could meet their eyes. They pretended not to see, as though her condition might vanish if ignored long enough. Behind closed doors, however, whispers grew louder. Some said it wasn't the first time the father had done this. Others claimed the family's bloodline had been bending in unnatural directions for decades. Old women muttered about curses. Men shook their heads but offered no help. The shame was hers alone to carry, though she had never asked for it. Inside the home, she felt more trapped than ever. The walls seemed to press inward, suffocating her with the stench of secrecy. Her father moved about as though nothing had changed, as though his role as both parent and abuser could exist without consequence. He never admitted guilt. In his mind, there was no crime, only possession. She was his child, his blood, and therefore his to take. This logic, twisted and cruel, was what kept the cycle alive. Late at night, when the house was quiet, she would press her hands against her stomach and feel the movements inside. Each flutter, each kick, reminded her of what was to come. A child that was both her sibling and her son, both her father's heir and his greatest crime. She often wondered if the baby could feel the shame already, if it would be born with the weight of secrets, already etched into its fragile bones. The world outside might have chosen silence, but within her there was no escape. Every day the truth grew heavier, stretching her body and soul until she could no longer recognize the girl she once was. She was no longer just a daughter, she had become the unwilling witness of a horror passed from one generation to the next. And soon she would deliver not just a child, but a new chapter in a nightmare that refused to die. As the months dragged on, the house itself seemed to conspire against her. Every creaking floorboard, every shutter rattling in the wind, reminded her that she was trapped in a web woven long before her birth. Her father's gaze followed her relentlessly, a constant reminder that no corner of the home was safe. The people outside could pretend not to see, but inside she was under constant scrutiny, suffocated by the ever-present reminder of what had happened and what was still growing within her. She began to notice subtle changes in herself, small fissures in her own sense of identity. Mirrors reflected a stranger, someone who carried both innocence and burden in the same body. Nights were the worst. The silence pressed down like a weight, and the shadows in the corners seemed alive, watching, waiting. She would trace the outline of her swollen belly and feel the tiny movements of a child that should have been her sibling, feeling both love and an unbearable horror at the truth of its existence. Conversations in the house became traps. Words were loaded with unspoken meaning. Her father spoke as though everything were normal, masking his crimes with routines and orders. Her mother, or the person who was meant to protect her, had long retreated behind a wall of denial, silently condoning what she could not confront. The air was thick with tension, every glance and gesture a reminder of the unnatural hierarchy that had dominated this family for decades. Outside, the town carried on in muted denial. Children played in the fields, oblivious to the cycles of shame happening behind closed doors. Adults exchanged knowing glances, but no one dared intervene. The whispers were always there, a constant reminder that secrets have a way of finding their voice, even when everyone tries to bury them. She felt the eyes of history upon her, the weight of a lineage that had refused to add or confront its sins, now pressing down on her shoulders with a force no child should endure. And yet, despite the fear and despair, a strange, fragile resolve began to take root. She was forced to carry more than just life. She carried the story of a family unwilling to speak its truths. Each day, each flutter from within her womb became a reminder that this horror could not remain hidden forever. Whether she chose to act, or whether the world finally forced her hand, the legacy of this household was reaching its breaking point. The final months of her pregnancy were a slow, grinding torment. Every day brought new reminders that the life growing inside her was a living symbol of the family's darkest sins. She could no longer escape the reality of what had happened, and the house itself seemed to conspire against her, walls whispering accusations, floors groaning with the weight of history. Her father's presence became unbearable, his control absolute, his denial of guilt a constant, suffocating force. Even outside, the world seemed to turn a blind eye. The neighbors averted their gaze, pretending not to see the swelling truth she carried, yet the whispers persisted, spreading like an invisible stain through the town. Some murmured that this was not the first time such acts had occurred. Others suggested the family had been bending their bloodline in unnatural ways for generations. The old women muttered about curses, shaking heads at doorways and windows. She had become a vessel for not just a child, but for the consequences of decades of silence, secrecy, and twisted devotion. At night, she pressed her hands to her stomach and felt the tiny, undeniable proof of her father's crime. Each kick, each movement became a reminder that innocence and horror could exist in the same body. She wondered if the child could sense the shame and fear surrounding them, if it would be born with the weight of secrets already etched into its fragile bones. Sleep brought no reprieve. Dreams were filled with distorted reflections of herself, of her family, and of a world where love had been warped into possession. And then the day came when the inevitability could no longer be postponed. The child entered a world already marked by horror, a new chapter in a cycle that had refused to end. She held the infant close, feeling both the instinctive warmth of a mother and the cold, horrifying truth of the child's origin. It was a paradox of life and sin, of hope and despair, of innocence and monstrosity. In that moment, she understood the weight of her inheritance. The family's secrets, kept for generations, had finally found a vessel. And as she looked into the child's eyes, she realized that breaking the cycle would require confronting the darkness the town and her own family had worked so hard to bury. The past could not remain hidden forever, and now neither could she. After the birth, the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves remembered the sins that had taken place within them. Every room, every corridor carried the echoes of generations who had chosen silence over truth. She moved through the home like a ghost, aware that nothing would ever be the same. The child was a living reminder of the darkness that had been nurtured in secrecy, a symbol that the family's legacy could not simply be buried or ignored. Her father retreated into himself, but his presence was still suffocating. He had lost some measure of control, yet his denial remained, a brittle shield against the reality he could no longer escape. Those around him, family members who had long turned a blind eye, now grappled with their own guilt, with the knowledge that their silence had allowed a cycle to continue unchecked. It was a quiet, grinding reckoning, invisible to the outside world, but impossible to ignore for those inside. She spent hours observing the child, tracing the delicate fingers and fragile limbs, torn between instinctive love and the horror of what the baby represented. Each movement of the newborn was a reminder of the sins of the past, a living testament to a cycle that had refused to end. And yet, amid the fear and despair, she felt a strange, fragile resolve beginning to grow. Perhaps the child could survive. Perhaps this new life could be different if she could find the courage to break the unspoken rules that had governed their family for decades. Outside, the town continued in its quiet denial. Neighbors whispered, elders shook their heads, children played in fields unaware of the shadows lingering behind closed doors. But she understood now that some truths, no matter how carefully hidden, cannot remain silent forever. They seep into the world like water through cracks, finding their way into the lives of those who were meant to get. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? It's a question few could answer without feeling the weight of fear, shame, and inevitability pressing down, and for her, that question would shape every decision, every breath, every heartbeat that followed. Time passed, and with it came a fragile, uneasy rhythm. The child grew, small and silent, carrying the invisible weight of a family legacy that no one could escape. She watched every movement, every glance, haunted by the knowledge that her own history and her father's crimes were etched into this new life. Love and horror existed side by side, inseparable, and each day reminded her that innocence could coexist with darkness. Her father grew older, slower, his presence less commanding, yet the shadow of his control lingered. Even as the household adjusted to the new reality, the echoes of decades of secrecy haunted every room. Conversations were stilted, gestures careful. Everyone understood that the past could not be fully erased, but they also knew that the future was theirs to shape. The weight of silence still pressed down, but now she was learning to bend that weight into something like resilience. The town, meanwhile, carried on, oblivious or unwilling to confront what had happened behind closed doors, but whispers never fully disappeared. Every so often, a passing glance or a fleeting word reminded her that history has a way of lingering, of reaching out to those who try to forget. Some truths, once unearthed, refused to stay buried, and her family's story was one of those truths. She began to imagine a life where the cycle could end, where the child could grow without the inherited burden of shame and horror. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was a hope nonetheless. She understood that breaking a legacy of silence required courage, a willingness to face the darkness and expose it to the light, even if it meant confronting the most painful parts of herself and her family. In the quiet moments holding the child, she sometimes allowed herself to dream of normalcy, of laughter without fear, of a lineage that could finally be freed from its own shadows, and, in that fragile dream, she glimpsed the possibility of breaking the chains, rewriting a story that had long been dictated by secrets, control, and shame. The story does not end with simple justice or redemption. Life, in its cruel complexity, continued to move forward, carrying the weight of everything that had come before. She raised the child with a careful vigilance, each day a balancing act between protecting innocence and confronting the past. The shadows of the family's history were never fully gone, but they became a guide, a warning of what silence and denial can breed. She learned to speak quietly, to document memories, to confront the truths that had long been buried. The child grew under her watchful eyes, shielded as best as possible from the darkness that had shaped its origin, and slowly, imperceptibly, the cycle began to loosen. Generations of secrecy, abuse, and shame had left deep scars. But within those same walls, new possibilities emerged. Love could coexist with horror, hope could grow in the soil of despair, and truths, once revealed, could begin to heal. The town, oblivious or willfully blind, remained largely unaware, but the family had changed in ways that mattered. The girl who had once been a victim, now a mother, had become a witness, a keeper of history, a breaker of silence. She carried the knowledge that confronting darkness is never easy, but it is necessary if the horrors of the past are to be prevented from repeating. Some stories, she realized, are not meant to be forgotten. They linger in whispers, in the creaking of old floors, in the fleeting glance of a stranger passing by. They are reminders that human nature is capable of both profound evil and astonishing resilience. And sometimes, the most haunting stories are not those told in history books, but those hidden behind closed doors, whispered only in the hearts of those who survived. As the years pass, the child grows, and with each step, the legacy of horror loosens its grip, and yet the story remains, a chilling reminder that some truths, however dark, must be faced, for silence can be as deadly as the sins it conceals, and the courage to confront the past is often the only hope for a different future. The echoes of this family's nightmare will never completely fade, but for the first time in generations, there is a chance that light might seep into even the darkest corners. And sometimes, that fragile glimmer is all we have.